If you ask 10 different security leaders what a risk assessment actually is, you'll probably get 10 different answers. Some think it's a spreadsheet. Some think it's a once a year compliance exercise. Some think it's something the auditors require and nobody else looks at. Today we're going to cut through that and talk about what a risk assessment actually is, how to do one properly, and just as importantly, how to keep it alive through ongoing risk review. Let's start with a simple definition. A risk assessment is the process of identifying what could go wrong, figuring out how likely it is and how bad it would be if it did, and deciding what you're going to do about it. That's it. Everything else is detail on top of that core idea. The reason this matters so much is that a risk assessment is the translation layer. It takes everything else we've talked about across this series: policy gaps, secure development, life cycle findings, scan results from SAST, DAST, infrastructure and software composition analysis, architecture risks, AI and blockchain specific reviews, privacy assessments, and turns all of that technical detail into something a business leader can actually use to make a decision. Without this translation layer, you end up with a pile of technical findings that nobody outside the security team can interpret. And decisions get made based on gut feel or whoever's loudest in the room, instead of based on actual risk. Let's walk through the standard risk assessment methodology step by step in plain language. Step 1 is identifying your assets. An asset in this context is anything of value to the organization that could be affected: systems, data, applications, infrastructure, even reputation and relationships. You can't assess risk to things you haven't identified, so this step often reveals gaps on its own. A common discovery during this step is finding systems or data stores that nobody had formally documented, sometimes called shadow IT, or finding that the asset inventory that supposedly exists is significantly out of date. Step 2 is identifying threats. For each asset, what could go wrong? This includes things like unauthorized access, data breaches, service disruption, data corruption, and loss of data entirely. It's worth thinking about threats from multiple angles: external attackers, but also insider threats, whether malicious or accidental, and third-party or supply chain risks, where a vendor or partner becomes the entry point. Step 3 is assessing likelihood. For each threat against each asset, how likely is it to actually occur? This is often where assessments go wrong, because likelihood can feel very subjective. A few things help ground this. Look at your existing scan results. If SAST and DAST keep finding the same category of issue across your code base, that increases the likelihood of that type of threat materializing. Look at industry data. What kinds of incidents are common for organizations similar to yours? And look at your own history. Has something like this happened before, even in a near-miss form? Step 4 is assessing impact. If this threat materialized, what would actually happen? Impact isn't just about technical disruption. Think about it across multiple dimensions: financial impact, direct costs like incident response, regulatory fines, and potential lawsuits. Operational impact: can the business keep functioning, or does this stop critical processes? Reputational impact: how would customers, partners, and the market react? And regulatory or legal impact: does this trigger mandatory breach notifications, or violate specific compliance requirements you're subject to. Step 5 is calculating the overall risk level. The simplest and most widely used approach is to combine likelihood and impact, often using a simple scale, for example, low, medium, high, and critical for each, and then plotting them on a grid. A threat that's unlikely but would be catastrophic, if it happened, lands in a different place than a threat that's very likely but would only have minor impact. Both might need attention, but the nature of that attention is different. This is often visualized as a heat map, which frankly is one of the most useful single artifacts you can put in front of a board, because it immediately shows where the biggest concerns are without anyone needing to understand the technical details underneath. Step 6 is determining treatment. For each identified risk, there are generally 4 options. You can mitigate the risk, taking action to reduce either the likelihood or the impact. This is the most common path and includes things like remediating a vulnerability, implementing a new control, or improving a process. You can accept the risk, formally acknowledging that the risk exists, deciding it falls within acceptable tolerance, and choosing not to take further action right now. This needs to be a conscious, documented decision, made by someone with the authority to make it, not something that happens by default because nobody got around to it. You can transfer the risk, most commonly through insurance, or by contractually shifting certain responsibilities to a third party, though it's worth noting that transfer rarely eliminates reputational risk, even if it addresses financial risk. And you can avoid the risk entirely by not engaging in the activity that creates the risk in the first place. For example, deciding not to launch a feature that would require processing a category of data you're not prepared to protect. Step 7, and this is the step that turns a one-time exercise into an actual program, is documenting everything in a risk register. Let's talk about what a good risk register actually looks like, because this is the artifact that everything else feeds into and that leadership will actually interact with. Each entry in the risk register should include a clear description of the risk, written in business language, not just a technical finding, ID. It should include the assessed likelihood and impact, and the resulting overall risk level. It should include the current treatment decision, mitigate, accept, transfer, or avoid, and if it's being mitigated, what the mitigation plan actually is. It should include an owner, a specific named person or role responsible for that risk, not the security team in general, but someone who can be asked directly, what's the status of this? It should include a target date for the mitigation, if applicable, and it should include a status and ideally a history of how that status has changed over time, so you can see whether risk is trending up or down. One thing worth emphasizing, a risk register is not a list of vulnerabilities. A vulnerability scan might produce hundreds or thousands of individual findings. The risk register operates at a higher level, grouping related findings into meaningful risk statements. For example, instead of 50 individual entries for 50 outdated library versions, the risk register might have one entry. Outdated third-party dependencies create elevated risk of exploitation via known vulnerabilities, with the 50 findings as supporting detail and a single owner and remediation plan. Now let's shift to risk review, because this is where a lot of organisations fall short. They do the big risk assessment once, often because an audit required it, produce a nice document, and then that document sits untouched until the next audit cycle. A year later, by which point it's almost entirely out of date. Risk review is the ongoing process of keeping that risk register alive and accurate. A few principles here. First, cadence matters. A full formal risk assessment, going back through all the steps we discussed, is typically done annually or triggered by a major change, a significant new product launch, an acquisition, a major architecture change, or a significant incident. But the risk register itself should be reviewed much more frequently, often quarterly, to update statuses, check whether mitigation plans are on track, and identify any new risks that have emerged. Second, your risk review should be fed by your ongoing activities, not done in isolation. If your monthly SAST and DAST results show a new pattern emerging, that should flow into the risk register. If a new vendor is onboarded, that should trigger an update to your third-party risk entries. If an architecture risk analysis session uncovers something new, that becomes a new entry. The risk register should feel like a living reflection of your actual security posture, not a document that gets dusted off periodically. Third, track trends, not just snapshots. A risk register that shows the same 15 risks at high severity for 3 years in a row tells a very different story than one where you can see risk being actively mitigated, moving from high to medium to low over time, even as new risks are identified. This trend view is often the single most valuable thing you can show to a board or to leadership, because it answers the question they actually care about. Are we getting safer over time or not? Fourth, make sure accepted risks get periodically re-reviewed. A risk that was accepted a year ago because the likelihood was low and the cost to fix was high might look very different today if the threat landscape has changed, if the system's role in the business has grown, or if new regulations now apply. Accepted risks shouldn't just sit there forever, untouched. They should come back up for review on a regular basis. Let's also talk briefly about who should be involved in risk review, because this isn't purely a security team activity. Technical owners need to be involved because they understand the actual systems and can speak to feasibility of mitigation options. Business stakeholders need to be involved because impact assessment requires understanding what a system or process actually means to the business, something the security team often can't fully judge on their own. And leadership needs to be involved, at least periodically, both to make formal risk acceptance decisions and to allocate resources toward mitigation. One more thing worth mentioning: communicating risk effectively to non-technical stakeholders is its own skill. A heat map is a great start, but pairing it with a short narrative for the top few risks, written in plain business language. What's the risk? Why does it matter to us? Specifically, what are we doing about it? And by when? Makes an enormous difference in how seriously it's taken and how well informed the resulting decisions are. To wrap up, a risk assessment isn't a document you produce once for an audit and then forget about. It's the process that takes everything happening across your security program, your policies, your scans, your architecture reviews, your AI and blockchain specific assessments, your privacy reviews, and turns it into a single, prioritized, living view of where your actual risk sits and what's being done about it. The risk register is the artifact. Ongoing risk review is the discipline that keeps it accurate. And together, they're what allow leadership to make informed decisions instead of guesses. This is the core of what RiskRecap delivers every month. We take everything you're already running and turn it into a risk register and a risk report that actually drives decisions with trends you can show your board and a clear picture of what to prioritize next.